Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another version of the Citizen Voice program. This week, I'm going to be continuing with the True U.S. History course that I'm presenting. And also, I want to let you know that next week, we will begin our first interview. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that later. It'll also be in announcements that we send out through the social media programs that we have available. I want to thank WCN TV for hosting us live in this program, in this format. I also want to thank Strike Force of Prayer for depositing the links to our video programs. And we also have a new place where we're depositing those links in addition to our own website at Citizen Sentinel Network. We are now on UMaker, where we have the video presentations deposited there. So we want to move forward. I have a lot of information to present today on the effort of founding Jamestown and moving forward into developing Jamestown. As I mentioned last time, they needed to build a fortress. The people came across the ocean into this new world as they believed it to be, but it was a world that was inhabited by quite a number of Indians everywhere in North America, Central America, and also in South America. So this map that we have here to show of the North American area, much of this was inhabited already, most likely, according to whatever primitive records we have, of about 100 different nations of Indians. And this color-coded map kind of shows you pretty much where the Indians located, where they centralized. But we talked a little bit about how long the Indians had been in North America. And the estimates of archaeologists, anthropologists is 20,000 years, possibly more. The Indians might say that they were here forever, but that's a debate. The thing is that we want to talk about Smith and how he got here and all the colonists that came across. They came by the similar route that Columbus came, interestingly enough. And you're talking essentially 1492 was Columbus's first journey. He also was in the 1500s, his last journey. So you're talking essentially 100 years, but they still were following this route, and which is a little bit different than the Viking route from the north. So the essence is that they came up from the Caribbean along the coast of North America into this area of Virginia. And Smith and Company were the ones who came. They were essentially commissioned. The Virginia Company were a group of individuals who essentially entrepreneurs who were trying to invest and get wealthy. They wanted to cash in on whatever gold rush that the Spaniards had been able to cash in on 100 years before. So the British got into this routine about 100 years later, and they came into this area. This was all an area that they wanted to focus on in a much more thorough manner before they even began, because they know that the island community of the Roanoke Island people just disappeared. So the Virginia Company basically were looking for a specific area inland, away from, say, hurricane-type winds, and also in an area where there would be some fertile soil to plant crops, this kind of thing. And these were all in directions that were given. And when these people came across, they didn't necessarily know what to expect, but they had journals that Columbus left and other explorers had put information together. And these were the guidelines of what they needed to do. However, oftentimes when we study history, it's from a European-centric position. And what I want to do is also give a little bit more balanced perspective. One of the slides that we showed last time was the town of Pomoyoc. And this is coastal Virginia. You can see that they had put up some kind of barricades around their village. This is an early depiction from a European who came to this area of Virginia. But the Indians, they were aware of these Europeans coming. You looked at this picture last time if you were on in the class. The Indian lookouts, they could pay attention to the ships, and also they probably very interested if ships were coming inland or coming towards the shoreline, and ultimately sending smaller boats to come inland. The Indian shoreline along the coast where Jamestown is, it's along the James River. And so the shoreline, it permits people from the shore to look out into the water. And if you actually look closely, if Spencer actually zooms in on this, this is from my visit to Jamestown. You can look through the trees, hide in the brush, and essentially not be seen by the explorers or the exploration party. So this is, you can see the ships here, and this permits the Indians to be able to kind of monitor what's going on along the shore, to see exactly what the intent of the explorers really are. Some explorers would simply come ashore for fresh water or for food. They would go fowling or maybe fishing at some point. But once the Indians, and these are the Powhatan Indian people along this area where Jamestown was formulated, and there's several different tribes of the Powhatans at this point. They would have been able to see there were essentially three ships that came across the Atlantic on this journey. One was the Susan Constant, the other was the Godspeed, and then the Discovery. So they left in 1606. And I want to make a correction. I think last time I was paying attention to what I was saying on screen, and I was talking about a ship that was meant to supply the Jamestown colony, and it was destroyed in 1502. The unfortunate reality is that the colony didn't exist in 1502. So it was somewhere in the neighborhood of I think just after the origin point, so probably around 1608, 1610, somewhere in there, that the supply ship was destroyed. And the reason that that was important, the correct date, essentially is that John Rolfe was on that ship, and he had a wife and a child. They lost their lives in the Caribbean. This ship was destroyed off the coast of the Caribbean. The captain of that ship, as I mentioned last time, was able to salvage it pretty much by running it aground. So the ship wasn't destroyed completely, and they kept doing salvage efforts, sailing down to that area where the ship was run aground to be able to get some of the supplies that they originally had, that the things that would not spoil or be destroyed. So the Indian community in this area of Jamestown would have seen these ships. They would have seen the ships kind of putting this. This, of course, is a modern day. These are replicas that I'm going to be showing, because my journey to Jamestown was not across water, but I drove across the country. So I took pictures when I was there. This is more likely the model of the Susan Constant. The Godspeed replica is interesting here. This is the name on the area of the foredeck, the Godspeed. This is a modern replica of the three ships that came into this area, and this is what the Indians probably would have seen. This is another vantage point of the Godspeed. Now, I'm going to show you a diagram here of the Godspeed so that you can a little bit more appreciate what that kind of ship looked like. The people usually were crammed below deck, And they had not only food below deck, but they also had military equipment there to protect themselves, which means that, they probably were sitting next to kegs of gunpowder at some point. But this is a sign that is near those ships on the dock near the Jamestown Museum, which is, now it's a very famous attraction for people to come and see what the history of this British colony was like. And I want to emphasize that it was a British colony, as opposed to, say, the 1619 project, which kind of attempts to lump history into a big blending bucket where, of course, the people who came across the ocean and settled in Jamestown in 1607, they basically were Americans, and the United States of America existed at this point in time, which is a falsity and an abrogation of history. So when we look at history, we need to look at the dates, we need to look at timelines, we need to understand the actual results of what happened as people made these things take place. So these ships came from England. It was a British colony. And the Indians had no clue as to, who these people were. They knew that they were foreigners. They didn't understand the language necessarily. But from the vantage point of the Indians, they saw these huge vessels compared to what they were used to in their own efforts to manage the waterways. And this area is very, very large body of water with the Chesapeake Bay nearby and the Atlantic Ocean. So a lot of water. And so the Indians did make their own efforts to sail around or to canoe around the area, and wanted to show, say, the effort a little bit later, what the Indians had to do to create ships. So when they saw these ships and how elaborately they were made, and they saw the sails, they must have marveled at that kind of technology at that point in time. And even the concept of technology today is a very simplistic term, but in those days, the making of something this elaborate would have probably been very amazing to the Indian people, based on what we will look at in a few minutes. But the colonists, it was, I think, maybe 105 colonists who came on these three ships. They basically had to get out. They had to start working the area, and they didn't have a nice little dock that I was showing you here with the three ships sitting there. But they probably got in the ships. They had to get out into the water, walk up, in water-clogged clothing, and then they had to begin the efforts of colonizing this effort. And so that meant one of the primary things was unloading the ships, preparing to build some type of fortress where they could be protected. So this is an early depiction. It's a woodcut of, what it may have been at that point in time when they first began cutting the trees down. Now, from the standpoint of the Indians, they saw them cutting the trees down. And the Indian people, even though they would cut trees down, they looked at this from a very different perspective than the English. And this is probably pretty true of anywhere there would have been this intermingling of cultures from the European colonizing countries and the people who lived here in this area before. So from this standpoint, the object, and basically the whole point, was to build James Fort, which is what you will see here on the next slide. The fort basically started down by the river, and as it grew, more houses were developed at some point. They built the houses outside the fort because that's where the farming would take place, where more land would be available. And so the point eventually was to build this fort. And this is a depiction of that fort on the James River. However, Indian villages were nearby. The Sokotan village, which I showed you last time and in a previous presentation that I made, the Sokotan village, it shows how well organized it was. And this is from an Englishman who drew this diagram from his experience of this village, which is also near the coastal land. So you have the planting of the crops, pretty orderly there, and the arrangement of the houses. These are typical houses of the Indian people. I'm going to show later the Jamestown Museum that has some Indian huts that they have created there on that site of the museum property. I'll show you what that looks like, but they may not necessarily replicate what it looked like at that point in time. So the Indian village that I observed going through the Jamestown Museum showed huts that are a little bit different, more kind of rounded and not as elongated. But these were, it's very likely that the people in the Jamestown Museum did their own due diligence in terms of what it looked like in that time. So you can imagine that they used some form of thatching of bark and, trying to strip the trees of the bark in the area, and they would thatch these walls of the homes together. So what you have then is the Indian villages, they're already there. A fort, they had directions on where to make the fort. So in some ways, they didn't have a choice, but they obviously were aware of the Indian villages nearby. And in fact, when John Smith eventually goes out and starts exploring this area, he finds several villages and he maps them out. But as the fort was built, the Indians would have seen the fort coming up. They would have seen the walls going up. So this is a picture that I took of the woods, looking from the woods to the fort. The Indians would have seen the walls of the fort go up, and they basically would have begun to understand these people are not going away. These people are here to stay. So not only did the chopping of the trees make an impact on their own understanding of what was going on, but actually they saw the construction. And so if you picture, what they may have thought, looking at the ships and looking at the building of the fort itself, they realized that these people were a very ingenious type of people because of the capabilities that they had to build these things. However, the building of the fort took a lot of energy, took a lot of industrious effort on the part of these people who came across. So who were these people that came across? Next week, when I interview Pastor Earl Wallace, we're going to be talking about the religious perspective of the people who came across, because there is a difference. There's a big difference between the people who came to the Jamestown community and the people who came to Plymouth. The Pilgrims, completely different type of people, even though they're both English, right? So look around in our society today. Even if you have, white people, you have all kinds of different variations of white people. You have different kinds of variations of Black people, of dark-skinned people, whether they be from, say, Asia, or whether they be Native Americans, or whether they be from the country of India. So everybody has different perspectives. Everybody has different belief systems. And one of the things you need to understand is how people lived within the culture of where they came from, and how they operated has a lot to do with how they operated, where they actually went, if they were in some realm of discovery. And so these people come across the ocean. Many of them were people who were indentured servants. These people indentured their lives to become a servant for a period of time, and usually it was a 7-year period. And so the thing is that you have this situation where people are voluntarily giving up their freedom to specifically work for the sake of whatever promises were made, whether it would, be a small plot of land or something like this, which is a little bit different construct than, say, a king giving a lord or some noble a plot of land because he fought next to him in the wars or whatever. Is a little bit different. I guess it's a different conception of how a person could become a landowner. And in essence, you have to work for it, you have to earn it, you have to sweat for it. However, there were also people who came across the ocean who were nobles. We saw this within the journeys that Columbus made. And the nobles had a certain perspective that life was owed to them, or specific things was, you know, uh, basically in their own concepts of what should happen when they were walking down the street, or what kind of attentiveness people should pay to them because they had a title of nobility. These kinds of people came from England as well. And they were some of the people that hired the indentured servants. They were some of the people that actually came to claim land, if they could, claim that land under, at this point in time, it was King James the First. So you have a different mentality. And it's very important to maintain an understanding of that mentality of what's going on in people's minds when they are doing the things that they're doing. So I want you to understand very basically, the King of England didn't ask anybody if he could claim this land that actually already was inhabited by the Indian people. However, from the standpoint of the Indian people, they didn't have the concept that, that land could be owned. They didn't have the concept of real estate, right? They believed, and pretty much this is consistent with much of the Indian village understanding throughout North America, that they were the caretakers of the land. So they didn't have the concept of ownership of a particular piece of land like Europeans did. And that European ownership essentially evolved over time, from the king owning everything that he could see or claim and protect essentially through warfare, to giving pieces of territory to the nobility. And now you have this understanding of people working the land for a period of time, and then they would be able to own that land, which is a big thing. Now, I want to help you understand something a lot of people don't really understand about American history. I don't know if anybody understands that Ben Franklin was an indentured servant at one point in time. So the concept that we have of indentured servitude or servanthood is a little bit different than it was back at that point in time in history, when the people from Jamestown came across, or people from England came across to create Jamestown. But one of the things that they needed to do was farm this land. One of the things that the Spanish understood is that there was not much gold in the Caribbean, even though they did a disservice to the Indian people there by trying to, essentially wring it out of them. But you can't get blood out of a turnip. All right. So the Spaniards then changed their focus from literal or physical gold to the gold that they could find by claiming the land. And this is basically what happened in Jamestown as well. The people needed to farm, but the problem was that many people didn't want to farm. And so some of the people, the kind of people that came, they believed that they could just steal stuff from the Indian people. And the essence of that is, it's not necessarily nice to steal. It's one of the 10 Commandments, I believe, thou shalt not steal. Yet you have these people who are supposedly Christians coming across the ocean, and they're willing to steal from the Indian people because they wouldn't work. So at one point in time, we begin to see that The workers who were supposed to be working, some of them did not want to work anymore. The lords or the nobles, essentially, may not want to work in the fields. It's hard work in the fields, and so you have another situation. The colony was founded in 1607. Then you have a number of people coming over, newer immigrants, so to speak, coming over to colonize the area, meaning to have to work in the area. However, one of the problems, the two issues that came up is that the laziness of the people and the inability to grow enough product or produce to survive. This created a problem with the James Fort area, that ultimately evolving into the Jamestown area. The issue of self-sufficiency or self-subsistence wasn't working properly. And so this is a depiction of one of the workers who was actually later in the overall scheme of things here. But the crop is not corn, it's tobacco. And this is an introduction, the contribution that was made by John Rolfe, one of the early colonists who I mentioned before. John Rolfe was able to transport tobacco crops, the plants of tobacco, into the soil of Virginia. And voila, you have a new cash crop that is actually able to save the colony. However, one of the first things that I want to allude to, and we're going to get into next week, well, not next week, but the next time we have a class on Jamestown, is the issue of Captain John Smith. One of the things that he does, he has to take responsibility for the colony because the guy who was the head of the colony died. Many people died in Jamestown at this point because they could not survive. And they died either because they starved to death or they were attacked by the Indians because they were stealing something from the Indians, or the Indians didn't want them on their land anyway, or in that land. So Smith becomes a key figure. He takes leadership, and there's controversy around him taking leadership. You can read, from the journals. Basically, one of the sources that I have that I use is the journals of Captain John Smith. Once we begin to understand this more deeply, we'll go into this a little bit more. I will delve into the journals, but one of the things that happens with John Smith on his journeys is he's captured by the Pamunkeys. And he's, in those days, you would tie this guy to a tree. And then what would happen is that you would cut off their limbs, literally cut the limbs off, and the Indians would throw the limbs into the fire if they didn't like you. Smith was captured. He was captured and he was almost killed a couple of different times. But there is this story that evolves from his capture of John Smith being saved by Pocahontas. So the thing is that when we look at this image of this man, John Smith, being captured, who was the leader, if he was not saved by Pocahontas, the colony of Jamestown probably would have dissolved and the Indians would have taken control of this area, taken control back. So the saving of John Smith becomes a key turning point in the Jamestown colony. We'll begin that session when we revisit Jamestown next time. Next week, we're going to have Earl Wallace, who is a pastor of Liberty Christian Fellowship, on, and he'll help us understand the religious dynamic that was going on with these colonists in the Jamestown community or colony. Thank you very much, everybody. Grateful that you could come into our class today out of a busy day. I hope that you can tune in next week for our interview with Pastor Earl Wallace of Liberty Christian Fellowship. Thank you much.